So when looking at the question, discuss the significance and legacy of the classical world, what we might want to look at a little closer are the writers of the classical world. The remarkable thing about the classical world and the classics is the literary output. Perhaps no time in history or no periods in history as the classical Greek world and the classical Roman world is as rich and significant in terms of its literary output. But of course, writers write different things. We have writers of history, writers of philosophy, we have writers of comedy and drama, playwrights, we have poets. And if we look at all of these categories, again, the classical world is particularly rich. If we were to look at the Romans, well, the Romans, particularly around the period after the Republic fell, this is a great irony. The Republic has fallen. If we read Tom Holland's Rubicon, the Republic is dead. Chapter 11, the final chapter, Death of the Republic. But Tom Holland spends a lot of time in chapter 11 of Rubicon talking about writers of the Augustinian era. When the Republic falls, the last man standing, the last powerful man is Octavian. Octavian declares himself Augustus Caesar. He is the August Caesar. He is taking over from the murdered Julius Caesar. He will restore Rome's traditions. He will restore stability to Rome. Augustus. And he's helped or assisted in this by some of the writers. And Tom Holland talks about this, how writers like Virgil and Livy, a poet like Horace, they restore a sense of pride to Romans. They imagine a glorious image for Rome. Perhaps what we might call today propaganda. They are the propagandists of the Augustinian era, and their great works are read today in classical studies. They have stood the test of time. They continue to inspire and impress. Perhaps the most significant is Virgil. Virgil wrote the Aeneid, and you want to look closely as to what the Aeneid tells us, Aeneid, this great poetic work that links the Romans with the ancient Greeks. It links the Romans with the story, the myth of Troy. So here we have a direct link from Virgil back to Homer. When we look at classical Greece, we have the great Greek writers, Homer, who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. And then we have Herodotus and Thucydides, who wrote these great and significant histories. Herodotus wrote the Histories, a tale of the Persian Wars, and Thucydides wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War, with great episodes like the Melian Dialogue. But jumping forward, we see that Virgil is inspired by these writers. Virgil is definitely inspired by Homer. He almost writes the sequel to the Iliad and the Odyssey. His hero, Aeneas, travels to Rome. He's shipwrecked in North Africa, he's shipwrecked in Carthage, but eventually ends up in Rome and becomes a founding father of Rome. And so Virgil attempts to link ancient Troy to Rome under Augustus. So you can see that this is an act of propaganda, an act aimed to bolster Augustus and bolster the self-image and the grand image of Rome. Perhaps nowhere has as much romantic significance as Troy, the famed city of Troy. So who wouldn't want to be connected with Troy? So as Troy was a great city, so too is Rome under Augustus a great city. As Tom Holland writes on page 370 of Rubicon, there's this great quote: Virgil wrote a great epic of the Roman people. The Roman people can be proud of their heritage now thanks to Virgil's great epic. And there are other writers too, like Livy, who wrote of the foundations of Rome. And then Horace, who was patronized by Augustus. Augustus was his patron, just like the Renaissance painters had their patrons. Augustus has is a patron of the writer Horace. And Tom Holland quotes Horace as well as reminding Romans of the good life, of getting out of the rat race, he calls it. And so other great writers of the period, Ovid, Livy, and Virgil. And so even within these writers, and we can look in Rubicon, and Tom Holland draws extensively from these writers. So even today, their words inspire works, modern works of history like Rubicon. And they themselves were inspired by other classical writers of ancient Greece. So here's that link between ancient Greece and ancient Rome and today. So what's significant? What great legacy does the classical world have? Well, it's embodied in the works of Virgil, the works of Horace, the works of Livy. We can also look at philosophy. Philosophy is also a legacy of the ancient world. If you were to stop somebody on the street and ask them to name some of the great philosophers, no doubt they would name Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, who were the great Greek philosophers. But in Rome, there are other philosophers too. Tom Holland talks a lot about Cicero. If you were to plow through the footnotes and index of Rubicon by Tom Holland, he talks a lot about Cicero. Cicero was a Roman politician, but he was also a prolific writer on politics and philosophy. How should all these great philosophical questions that Aristotle and Plato attempted and Socrates spoke to? How should men live? How should men be governed? What is a good life? What is the purpose of life? The great philosophical questions. Cicero attempts to answer them. But of course, Cicero wasn't the only Roman philosopher. You've other philosophers like Seneca, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius. And it doesn't take long on the internet to search for some of the writings of Seneca and Cicero, Cicero, and Marcus Aurelius. In this age where quotes, themes, and memes are popular, the themes and quotes of Marcus Aurelius, of Cicero, and Seneca are still particularly popular today. And so, again, great writers in the Greek classical period, Aeschylus, Hesiod, Homer, writing these great works of literature. History, we know about the history of the Persian Wars thanks to Herodotus. If you were to look at Persian Fire by Tom Holland, it is littered with references to Herodotus. He could not write this work without reference to Herodotus. Little wonder then that Herodotus is known as the father of history. So in answering the question, what's the significance and legacy of the ancient world, you look at the writers, ask what did they write? I've covered a tiny portion of what they've written. All of these works, of course, are available online, and summaries of them are available online. And then you ask, why is it significant? Well, we already know why Virgil's works are significant. They talk about the era of Augustus. Similarly with Livy and Horace, they reflect the era when Romans were looking for a greater self-image. There are other Roman historians as well, on par with Herodotus and Thucydides, who are the great historians who documented Rome's empire, who documented Rome as it conquered all of Europe, as it claimed Mare Nostrum. Well, we know about Carthage and the Third Carthaginian War thanks to Polybius. Polybius is the writer who wrote about the Third Carthaginian War, how Scipio Africanus wept as he saw Carthage burn to the ground. We know that thanks to Polybius, the great Greek historian who was captured and held hostage by the Romans and wrote these great histories of Rome and its wars. Polybius, Polybius. 150 years later, we have another Roman historian, Tacitus, Tacitus. Now, Tacitus is known for his history, the Agricola, his history of the conquest of Britain, of Britannia. And Tacitus has some very important points to tell us, because while the Romans had conquered the world, Tacitus questions it somewhat. And there's this great quote from Tacitus where he imagines someone being conquered by Rome. Tacitus, in his history, imagines those conquered by Rome bemoaning what Rome is doing. He puts himself into the mind of Calgacus. Tacitus puts himself into the mind of Calgacus, a Celtic chieftain. And a chieftain is saying, these Romans have conquered all over the world. There is no place left to flee. We are here at the ends of the earth. We are here in northern Britain, and still the Romans conquer, says Calgacus. The Romans conquer everywhere. They say they are spreading civilization, but they're only spreading death. They have created a wasteland and called it peace. That's the great line that Tacitus is most remembered for. They have created a wasteland and called it peace. So just like Thucydides is known for the Melian dialogue, Tacitus is known for this great line. They have created a wasteland and called it peace. And he's criticizing the Roman Empire. They have created a wasteland and called it peace. So already in this discussion, we've covered close to 20 writers of the classical period. From Homer, Herodotus, and Thucydides to the Greek philosophers, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. We can jump to the Roman philosophers, Seneca, Cicero, and Marcus Aurelius.